All right, so thanks very much, everybody, for joining us for MUHC Medical Grand Rounds. I just remind everybody that please keep your microphones on mute throughout the presentation. We invite you to write your comments and questions in the chat. And before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that McGill University which is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. I'd like to introduce, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marcel Behr. It requires no introduction to this department. Marcel provided a three-line bio, but I've gone online and gotten additional bio information from Marcel. So Marcel's the founding director of the McGill International TB Center. He completed his MD at Queen's University and his medical training and ID training and med micro training at McGill University, along with a BSc in Epi and Biostats. He did a postdoc in molecular epidemiology and bacterial genomics at Stanford University. He's a full professor of medicine, has a long track record of both external salary support and peer-reviewed funding. Required or obtained FRQS funding right through to Chercheurs National. It is now a CRC Tier 1. Has a long track record of external peer-reviewed funding that's continued to date with NIH funding and CIHR funding. He's a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and the Royal Society of Canada. Very prolific author and also leader, again, as Division Director of Infectious Disease, and also the MI4 initiative at McGill. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Marcel and thank Marcel as well for pitching in at the very last minute as we had a cancellation, and he kindly offered to help us out. Marcel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, for the lengthy introduction and the kind introduction. Do you hear me? Is the audio good? Good. So I was trying to think of some ideas I've been working on recently that would have both a kind of a parochial message and also some sort of a broader message. So I decided to focus on definitions and how the way we frame a set of words can help define conditions and how that's important for clinical care and research. And I'm going to give two lessons. And then whenever you find a problem, you have to help to try to find a solution. So I'm going to tell at the end of what I'm going to do next. So I did not go forward. Here we go. Okay, so in terms of conflict of interest, in the standard private sector, things like ad boards and giving talks and stuff like that, since I came back in 1998, I haven't been invited to give a talk on TB by a company, so that made it easier. I had a patent. I had a patent in 1999 that led to royalties for the quantiferon test, and that ended 2 years ago. Otherwise, I don't get any funding from the private sector. I have public funding for epidemiology and pathogenesis of mycobacterial infections, a CIHR grant. CF Canada lapsed. There's an NIH grant coming on, and I'm a subcontractee from a Gates Foundation grant. And in terms of recommendations, so you can see what you should do differently at the end of this talk. The answer is there shouldn't be anything differently. I will not be making any management recommendation. I'll be using words to talk about words. So to make sure the cardiologists are all watching rounds today, Nadia, this is a picture of Chopin's heart. It's got a fibrinous pericarditis, and there's some tubercles on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a poll. I'm going to have a lesson about zoonotic TB, a very simple concept, a lesson about latent TB, also a potentially simple topic. And then I'm going to talk about work I'm doing with some other people on a tuberculosis dictionary. So the audience poll here is you can write in the comments your answer to the following simple question, and I'll come back to it later on. Latent TB was first defined as A, somebody with a positive TST and a normal X-ray. B, somebody with a positive TB and no pathology. C, somebody with pathology who was clinically well. D, somebody who had a positive culture but was otherwise clinically well. And E, somebody with a positive TST who was clinically well. And I'm not going to be able to monitor them, but you can bank your answers now. And then later on, we'll see if we have any changes later in the talk. So I'm going to talk about zoonotic TB, and there'll be a TB lesson and general lesson. And part of this work was published a couple of years ago by Shannon Duffy, who's in my lab. So what is zoonotic TB? From a definition point of view, the easiest definition would be to have tuberculosis and a zoonosis, and you put these two together. And you have to say, what's a zoonosis? And most dictionary definitions of a zoonosis is an infectious disease that can be transmitted to humans from animals. Of course, humans are animals, so it really means transmitted to humans from non-human animals. Yet, if you go to the World Health Organization and the FAO and the OIE and the WOA, there's a whole bunch of these international non-governmental organizations that have very strict definitions. And in their case, zoonotic TB is a form of tuberculosis in people caused by Mycobacterium bovis. And that's the regulatory definition. So you sort of say, well, maybe they got it wrong. So what do you do in 2023 when you don't know the answer to something? You go to ChatGPT, of course. And when you go to ChatGPT, it says zoonotic tuberculosis, also called bovine tuberculosis or M. bovis infection, is a form of TB that can be transmitted between animals and humans. It's caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium bovis, which affects cattle, but also goats, deers, and humans. So you'll see that ChatGPT also says zoonotic TB is TB due to Mycobacterium bovis. If you read on, it tells you that it can come from consumption of it, unpasteurized milk or dairy products and other things that can happen. They even say that it primarily affects the lungs, but it can spread to other parts of the body. In my opinion, if it comes from consumption of unpasteurized milk or dairy products, it probably spreads to the lungs, not from the lungs. But that's something for me and ChatGPT to talk about after these rounds. So what causes zoonotic TB in India? This is a project led by Shannon from the lab and working with Joy Michael in Christian Medical College, Vellore. The concept here is India has the world's #1 human TB burden and also has the world's largest cattle herd. So you know the song New York, New York, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Well, zoonotic TB is kind of like that. If it doesn't happen in India, it's not happening anywhere because you have the greatest pressure of a zoonotic problem and a human epidemic at the same place. When Shannon took 940 human clinical bacterial isolates in pure culture, extracted the DNA and ran the PCR, she found 0 Mycobacterium bovis, none, not one. And this was a little bit surprising because there were a lot of estimates out there saying this was going to be a major burden in this country. So we kind of took a step back and said, well, what's going on there? There are different members of the Mycobacterium tuberculosis complex that are found in different species. There's a whole variety of them that are getting named with more and more genome sequencing and more discoveries that there's tuberculosis in seals or voles or meerkats. But the simplest form for this rounds that keeps it relatively straightforward is that in 1882, Robert Koch described Mycobacterium tuberculosis in the classical sense. In 1898, Theobald Smith described Mycobacterium bovis in a cow. And only recently in 2012, did somebody describe a completely different member of the family called Mycobacterium orygus because it was found in an oryx in a zoo in the Netherlands. And these three are loosely of equidistance. It's not like M. orygus is a type of M. bovis or M. bovis is a type of M. orygus. You have basically 3 different bacteria. In ongoing work from a number of places in the world, the kind of global appreciation is the following. M. tuberculosis in the classic sense is the thing that took the life of Eleanor Roosevelt and made Nelson Mandela sick. M. bovis is the thing that makes the cows in North America and Europe sick, and it has spilled over to badgers in England, and it's spilled over to these things that are called brush-tailed possums in New Zealand. Meanwhile, M. orygus seems to be the thing that makes these animals in India sick. And according to my colleague Madhu Pai, he calls these skinny brown cows, and other people say these are zebu-like cattle. These cows on the left come from Bos taurus, and these cows on the right come from Bos indicus. And M. orygus is also found in this amazing animal, which is called a nilgai, or a blue bull. So one question, of course, is, are we looking for the wrong bacteria when we're in India? In fact, that's the case. Most of the TB in Vellore was Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but we did see M. orygus, and there were 7 cases, so just under 1%, and 6 out of 7 of them were extrapulmonary disease. The simple lesson here is if you look for a European bacteria in Asia, you may fail. This is the reason people are bird watchers. They look for different birds when they travel. And for all of these years, people assumed there was M. bovis in India. They couldn't estimate it, and they were looking for the wrong pathogen. Now, is this some harmless non-tuberculous mycobacteria? I don't think these images are consistent with a harmless organism that we can ignore. There is now a case series by Lydia Jennifer, who's up here in the top right, of 8 cases. All 8 have extrapulmonary elements. 2 of them have concomitant pulmonary disease, and 3 of them had disseminated multifocal disease. This 9-year-old girl was cured with medical management, and this 47-year-old man who had a multifocal paraspinal abscess required rods as well as medical management. So this is not common. I wouldn't say this is threatening TB control in India, but for the people who are getting M. orygus infection, it can be a nasty pathogen. We got contacted by Mahmouda Chowdhury in Lahore, Pakistan, and she's done a slaughterhouse study of 3,581 animals, and 34 of them had suspected TB. And once again, there's no M. bovis in Pakistan, at least in this study. There were 10 cases of M. orygus and 10 cases of M. tuberculosis. So this makes it a bit more complicated. If Mycobacterium tuberculosis is in the animals, and then it spreads to people, we don't have a simple way to say the thing that spread to people has a special name, because it may be the human pathogen is also in the livestock. So at this point, we have this sort of open question of where are the frontiers of Mycobacterium orygus. It's been seen in Pakistan and India and Bangladesh and Nepal and Bhutan, and we really don't know how many other countries have it, but Mycobacterium bovis does not seem to be a problem in those countries. So of course, this is sort of a semantic thing. You'd think all you have to do is change the name and change the title and the definition and everything will go away. But there are some lessons here. Mycobacterium bovis is found in cows, but it doesn't mean the cows only have Mycobacterium bovis. And it doesn't mean that cows are a singular entity. There's different cows in different parts of the world. And this reminds us of some of this classic high school multiple choice exams, which is if A then B does not mean if B then A. For instance, all professional basketball players tend to be tall, maybe 6'4" and higher. I'm not a professional basketball player, and Mark tells me that he has never been a professional basketball player. As you all know, he's a triathlete. So you have to be careful when you phrase things that you don't have an assumption that things are bidirectional. And we're going to come back to this kind of phrasing in the next part of the presentation. So latent TB, something you've all heard about, and we wrote about it in a couple of papers a few years ago, and you'll be reminded of some of the general lessons here. So you've all seen a case of latent TB, you've all referred to latent TB, some of you have treated latent TB. How could Marcel make this confusing? Well, right off the bat, there's 2 kind of concepts about this person with latent TB. Either it means the person is smiling because they feel fine, thanks, I'm doing okay. Or it means that do not disturb because I'm sleeping right now, and the bacteria is telling you that the bacteria is latent. So what is it? Well, again, you go to ChatGPT, you should get the answer, and it tells you LTBI, latent TB infection, is a condition in which a person has been infected with the bacterium, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but does not have active TB disease. And it occurs when the immune system controls the bacteria, preventing them from multiplying. So in LTBI, the bacteria are dormant or inactive, and they reside in the lungs, but can be found in other parts of the body. It's estimated that about a third of the global population is LTBI. So here are some of the bullets. The bacteria are dormant, and it's about 1/3 of the world's population is living with these dormant bacteria. So I guess one question is this true, and where's the evidence for that? Nadia, are you on the line? I just got, or John Vin, can you hear me?
I am.
Don, I just got paged by pharmacy 32545. Can you just call pharmacy and find out what they want and let me know after rounds? Thank you, Don. Okay. Thanks. Okay, so what are we talking about when we're talking about latent? There's a clinical definition of latent, there's a biologic definition of latent. In a clinical sense, latent is the opposite of patent. Latent means hidden from the Latin latera. And many of us, when we reached 50 and over, we developed something called latent hyperopia, where we didn't really realize that we were squinting a lot. We thought that the font of the Stanford guides for infectious disease was getting smaller every year, and you only find out you have hyperopia when you go to an optometrist and they formally assess you. In that sense, latent is the opposite of patent, where a patent defect is when you inspect a house and there's a hole in the wall. There's something painfully obvious. So if latent is the opposite of patent, in a medical sense, latent TB infections mean something that's not manifest, and TB is something that is clinically manifest. And that would be easy enough, but there's also a biologic definition of latent, where latent is the opposite of active. So in botany, for instance, latent buds are dormant and they wait for the rain or the sun or the better conditions, and then they will sprout out. And therefore active is no longer dormant. And so you could call that reactivation. So in that case, you would say you have a latent bacilli. So the adjective is describing the bacteria, and latent bacilli would be dormant. And the process called a reactivation TB means you have an active process which becomes inactive, which becomes active again. So you have sort of this switching over time. And this had become kind of confusing. So during COVID, one of the things I did when I needed a break from the other work is I started to just look in the literature and try to figure out where did this come from and who came up with these terms. And fortunately, there's a lot of things available in Google Books now, so you can kind of keep following things back in time. I found this guy here, Pierre-Charles Alexandre Louis, who was one of the first proponents of evidence-based medicine. So if anybody wants to know why we no longer use bloodletting for pneumonia, it was Pierre-Charles who said bloodletting is not a good treatment for bacterial pneumonia. And Pierre-Charles in 1825 said that out of 25 cases of phthisis, which was the French term for tuberculosis, about 8 of them, 125, had latent tubercles. That is 6 months to 2 years before the cough. So what he's really describing is what we now call in COVID terminology, pre-symptomatic TB. He's telling you there's an incubation period of 6 months to 2 years, and there are people who have tubercles before the symptoms present. Curiously, at around the same time, he has a competitor, and I think we often see that in science. Just when somebody has an important thing, somebody else publishes in the same year, and his competitor is René Laennec, who we all know as the inventor of the stethoscope. René referred to latent phthisis in his 1819 article, a treatise on the stethoscope, sur l'auscultation médiate, but he never defined it. Although in 1826, what he said is the majority, le plus grand nombre de phthisis sont latentes. And he talks about aucun signe de phthisie, and he says there are some who are tout à fait latentes, c'est-à-dire sans tout et sans expectoration. So both Laennec and Louis are saying that there are tubercles in somebody who's asymptomatic. when you go and dig deeper into it, and I was fortunate to work with Jacqueline Duffin, the history of medicine prof at Queen's, who had done her PhD on René Laennec. They had one big disagreement, which is Louis thought it was inevitable it would progress. So he called it pre-symptomatic, while Laennec thought this was asymptomatic and it may progress, but it could also just self-cure. It was just something that happened to people who never knew they had tuberculosis. So latent, way back in 1825, 1826, Phthisie latente of Louis and Laennec, later on latent tuberculose in German by Baumgartner, latent TB by Loomis in English. It was all referring to the presence of pathology in somebody who's clinically well. So it antedates a culture, it antedates the tuberculin, and it antedates the chest X-ray. And what the adjective does is it modifies the host. You have an infection, it's a latent infection. Curiously, in the early 20th century, people created a new term called latent TB, which they said, if we see pathology and we do a culture and it's positive, we'll call it TB. But if we take the control nodes, don't look really so bad, and we get it to grow, we'll call that latent TB. So now there's a new term called latent tuberculosis, which is finding bacteria in the absence of pathology. Then when you read it, it's actually non-specific pathology. It's hyperemic edematous nodes. So there's now a second definition of latent TB, which is the presence of bacteria in the absence of characteristic pathology. And then these people say, well, since the bacteria are there, but we're not seeing tubercles, it must be they've switched off their virulence mechanisms. And therefore, they must be dormant bacteria because they're present, but they're not causing any disease. So now the adjective has jumped from the host to the bacteria, and you start to read about latent bacilli. Then around 2000, the American Thoracic Society, the CDC in Atlanta, the Infectious Disease Society in America, and the World Health Organization come up with a third definition. And they say if you're TST positive and you're sick, you have tuberculosis. And if you're TST positive and you are not sick, you have this thing called latent tuberculosis infection. So now it doesn't talk about pathology, it doesn't talk about culture. It tells you that latent infection is modifying the host again. So coming back to the poll from earlier on, latent TB was first defined. It did not have a TST because in the 1820s, there were no TSTs. And it did not have a culture because in the 1820s, there was no culture and didn't have a TST. So even without knowing C is right, you know that A, B, D, and E are all wrong. The answer is C. And now you can all type something in the comment like it was rigged or the question was unfair or something like that. So why does this matter? It means that when you go to a scientific meeting and somebody says, I'm going to talk about latent TB, different people in the room think different things. Some people think, oh, you're talking about somebody who's got a little tuberculosis who's well. And somebody else, a bacteriologist, is going to say, oh, he's talking about how the bacteria go into dormancy, and somebody else is going to say, oh, this is about people with a quantiferon response. And if all they did is have three different definitions, it wouldn't be a big deal. But of course, it's possible somebody's going to say, oh, I think they're talking about somebody who's got tubercles that contain dormant bacteria and have a quantiferon response. And maybe they think all three are happening in the same person at the same time. It gets a little bit confusing. How do they become confusing? Well, here's, for instance, a WHO link that says latent TB is a condition in which the TB bacteria survive in the body in a dormant state. As I said, this was proposed around 1905, but it was never demonstrated. And here's one from the CDC that says many people with latent TB infection never develop disease. In these people, the bacteria remain inactive for a lifetime without causing disease. So when you combine the fact that people have sleeping bacteria and that the sleeping bacteria stay there for your entire lifetime. Oh, I don't know if I've jumped out of my screen share. Okay, we're good. You end up with these infographics. For instance, the WHO says 1 in 3 persons, 2.2 to 3 billion people have LTBI. And this becomes a very alarming problem. And it's in fact, almost unimaginably large. How do you deal with an infection in 2 to 3 billion people Who do you screen? Who do you test? How will you deploy treatments to 2 to 3 billion people? Now, when you concede that there's actually no evidence of dormant bacteria, and when you look harder in the literature and you find out that the majority of people seem to clear their infections in maybe 5 to 10 years, and we don't have a test for it, but we have several lines of investigation or several lines of evidence the majority of people do clear it, then you can start to revisit this. And just over a year ago, I attended a meeting with members of the World Health Organization who said, you know, it's probably not correct what we've been putting in our reports. And they put a core addendum in their World TB report. And they said, you know, in the past, we wrote a quarter of the world's population is infected with MTB. And they said, just take that out and put this thing in. A quarter of the world's population has been infected with MTB. And now going forward in each World TB report, they're using this past tense to say is or has been, which changes the numbers to an amount that we don't really know yet, but it's a considerable amount. So what's the general lesson? So you can either have concepts and you find tools for them, or you have tools that define the concepts. And we can see that over time, the tools have in some way shaped the concepts. And we still have this issue about bidirectional thinking. In 2000, the ATS said, latent TB infection with no disease. Persons in this class have a positive reaction to the TST. So basically they said, if you are infected, then you have a positive TST. In 2017, the American Thoracic Society said, those who develop a positive TST are considered to have latent infection. So that's more like if the TST is positive, then there is an infection. So let's just take the wording here and bring it to some other examples. I think we would all agree that persons with a urinary tract infection generally have a positive culture. And the cardiologists would probably agree that persons with a myocardial infarction generally have an elevated troponin. But if you write it the other way, we in infectious disease do not think that those who have positive urinary culture are considered to have a UTI. We get a lot of consults on them. I got consults last week while I was on the ID backup service, and we call somebody with a positive urine culture a bacteriuria. And I think those of you in cardiology or in internal medicine, the emerge, would not normally say that all those people who have an elevated troponin automatically have an MI. So this is how just a simple use of language, putting A before B, can lead to a certain amount of confusion. So it's, of course, great to have identified problems, but you're only as good as the solutions you propose, and you hope your solutions are no worse than the problems that were there before. I was fortunate in the March break to go to Antwerp, and if anybody ever goes there, there's a fantastic museum called the Plantin Moretus Museum, which is built around one of the first commercial printing presses in Europe. And they were printing so many books, they had so many fact checkers and word checkers that eventually there was a market for a dictionary. And there was a printed dictionary already back in 1599. And not only in the Antwerp language, but an etymologic dictionary comparing all the languages they were printing. So if you're ever in Antwerp, I highly recommend this museum. And you'll even see the typesets in these cases of the original Garamond font and the original Times New Roman font and things like that. So as I was getting interested in these definitions, I was contacted by other people who were also wondering about how definitions change. I think we all know that the meanings of words change with time. Awful used to mean full of awe, and now it means the opposite. And egregious, as you may or may not know, used to mean outstandingly good, and now it means outstandingly bad. It's still outstanding, it's just flipped directions. We know meanings vary by discipline. I mentioned a patent before. A patent foramen ovale in medicine means it's open. A patent defect in law means that it's evident. And you change the pronunciation to patent, and then you have a disclosure of an invention, an open disclosure. And meanings even vary by the other words in the same sentence. And some really cool examples are called contronyms, where the same word can have a completely opposite meaning. So when you use the word fast to describe a train, you mean something that's moving really quickly, but fast can also mean to hold immobile, to hold stable, such as our friends, the acid-fast bacilli. So given that words are changing and meanings are changing, really the question is not what was the original meaning of zoonotic or the original meaning of latent, but what's the definition we need tomorrow to inform the research and to inform the care. Alberto Garcia Bastero in Barcelona, he was also getting confused. And in parallel, he had started to compile terms that are used in different TB guidelines from the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, the International Union Against Tuberculosis. And what he thought was really interesting is there were terms that were used by different agencies that had different definitions. And even there were terms where there were different meanings even by the same agency across different publications. And then when you tried to look up how they came up with those definitions, you would find a reference to it and you clicked on the link and you often found something like this page cannot be found. So you had no way of going forward with this. All you knew is that you had to go back to the WHO homepage and check that the address is correct. So he compiled a list of all of these, and some of these have auto references. So failure includes treatment failed. It doesn't really help to say that failure is when something failed, you still haven't got a definition. There were also these incomplete links. There was a list of first-line drugs like INH, RIF, pyrazinamide, and ethambutol, but unfortunately, ethambutol didn't get its own link. The other three did, so I guess that means that the TB community is not very excited about ethambutol. And there were also these external references that TB meningitis was defined by a score, but it doesn't tell you where the score came from, and what if the score changes? Does that mean TB meningitis is now a different thing? There were also these kind of cool things. You could take a word like adherence, and in the same year, 3 different World Health Organization publications had a definition of adherence. And one of them said it's the extent to which a person's behavior corresponds with recommendations. And another publication from the same agency, the same year, said it's a proportion of children who received an adequate amount as defined in the statistical analysis plan for the intervention and control regimens. The third publication said adherence is taking 90% of medications. So even the same word could have a conceptual definition, a process definition, or some sort of a result or an outcome-based definition. So what did we decide to do with it? At first, it sounded like a great idea. Let's come up with a dictionary and solve the problems. And then I said to Alberto, well, we can't be the only people who ever thought about this. Are there other people who've had issues with terminology? And fortunately there were. And I said, well, why don't we learn from their failures and successes and see what we can do? So we found out that in 2021, the World Health Organization came up with an update on malaria terminology. And we said, good, why don't we find out who came up with that book and find out how they did it, what was the process, and did it work? So it was kind of cool to meet this person and to hear the reflections from another community. And here's Rick Steketee, who we had a meeting with. And here are some of the points he brought up in an email, but we also had a meeting. And we said, well, why did you do it? He says, well, we were trying to bring an amount of balance to recent trends of enthusiasm for acronyms. I don't know if anybody in this medical grand rounds feels there's a few too many acronyms floating around. I often have no idea what the acronym is referring to because different specialties use 3-letter acronyms to refer to different things. And he also said there were these cute terms like hotspots. They seemed kind of cool, but when you asked what is a hotspot, you couldn't really find a clear definition. He said they were trying to retire terms that were no longer in our typical language, but they put them in a separate document so they weren't totally lost. We had 2 other big issues that drove our work. The first is there was and still is confusion on what is meant by a case of malaria. So it's kind of interesting to think all these years later, we've known about malaria as a terrible infectious disease, And yet, if you ask people what is a case of malaria, they had to have a link to another document to describe the process of thinking about what is the definition of a case of malaria. It wasn't obvious to people that everybody in the world was talking about the same thing when they referred to a case of malaria. And then they said the second thing is we asked the experts to be succinct. And he asked other malaria experts across various fields with vectors, parasites, and humans to review each definition, because the goal was they were trying to see if they could get the wider malaria community to be able to speak to one another using common terminology. And I think that's really what Alberto and I have been trying to do also, is to make sure that everybody who's talking about TB, when they use a word, would be talking about the same thing. Otherwise, it can get very confusing. If the scientists in the lab are creating a tool that the clinicians are supposed to validate, that the public health people want to scale up, and they're not even talking about the same thing. So where are we in May of 2023? We were able to get it down from 536 terms to 230, and mostly about diagnosis, but some about monitoring, treatment, and prevention. We tried for each term to find one definition, usually the simplest and shortest. We took away terms that were not specific to TB. So the early version had things like the word adolescent. Well, an adolescent is different in different countries anyway, and it's not a TB specific concept. Things like a silhouette sign is not specific. It's something that happens, and it may happen in TB, but it could happen in other diseases. And where are we now? It's still a work in progress. And I don't know if there's going to be a market for it, and I don't know if it's going to be useful. And if anybody here on the call has ever written a dictionary, I'd be very interested to hear their input about what we could and what we should do next. So my final thoughts. I think definitions do matter. I think they matter for medical research, and they also matter for medical practice. I think if a definition is fuzzy or opaque or doesn't have a very precise meaning, I think it can be hard to design the appropriate research question. For almost a decade, I was the editor in charge of TB submissions at the Journal of Infectious Disease, and there were at least 100 articles comparing cases of TB to controls with LTBI. We don't know if all the controls in the LTBI group had infection, or if maybe the majority of them were uninfected and a minority was infected. And maybe the interesting research question was to look at the subset of the LTBI group rather than comparing the cases to the controls. So that's just one example. I think if the definition is unclear, it can also be hard to inform the medical decisions we take. And so for the students and the trainees who are on the call, my advice is if you don't know what someone is talking about, really just ask, what are you talking about? What is the thing you're describing? And if they give you an answer like, well, you know what it means, or you know what I was talking about, try politely to say, no, I still don't know. Could you please tell me what exactly you're talking about? The work I described here involved people in my lab, Shannon Duffy and Sarah Denchuk, who went to Vellore and did the zoonotic TB work, backstopped by Fiona, who runs the lab and keeps everything operating. There's an international kind of consortium of zoonotic TB researchers involving Vivek Kapoor in Penn State, Joy McGill at Vellore, and Mamouna Chowdhury reached out to us from the University of Veterinary and Animal Sciences in Lahore. The work on latent TB involved Eva Kaufman, who's now at Queen's, Paul Edelstein at UPenn, Lalita Ramakrishnan at Cambridge, and it was a great honor to work with Jackie Duffin, the historian at Queen's University, and I've been working with Alberto Garcia Bastero on the TB dictionary. And hopefully there's some time for questions. I'm going to stop sharing so I can take a look at the comments and see what happens next.
Thank you, Marcel. I'm in a room with lots of noise. Thank you. Wonderful presentation. Lots of new messages for us, showing us new definitions, and particularly very interesting discussion on latent TB, which of course I've had a chance to hear about, but I'm sure many have not. Dr. Folks, you had a comment there. Do you want to just open up your mic and share that comment with us, William?
Sure, yeah, nice. Thank you, Marcel, for that. I was interested because it's actually come up quite a bit in our own world in clinical cancer genetics, the question of what is a syndrome. Because for many years, people have talked about hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, which I've always been personally a bit uncomfortable with. Because the notion is, can you have a syndrome if there's nothing the matter with you? And if I do a physical exam, I find no features. So I think we're moving away from the idea of calling things syndromes. We're moving away from eponymous syndromes, and we're moving away from calling things syndromes. And now we're coming up, there's a whole move on, particularly at the WHO, to think about renaming, and through ClinGen and other resources, to rename a lot of these syndromes. And the model will be something like gene name, and then cancer or tumor, whichever is more appropriate, predisposition, and then you stop. You don't say anything about, you don't call it a syndrome, you just stop. So that's called, let's say, BRCA1 cancer predisposition. So if you've had a mutation of BRCA1, that's what you have, which doesn't imply anything about what might happen to you, because the reason is we don't know really what's going to happen to people, and the range of tumors are quite broad. So it's a similar kind of, I'm just commenting that it's a similar kind of question that we're facing. I was intrigued by the fact that, as you say, definitions matter. And I think we are trying to move away from these rather nebulous things like Lee-Fraumeni syndrome, where nobody really knows what you're talking about, and now moving on to things where you're being a bit more specific about what the problem really is. So
Sure.
Just a comment, and thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, so Will, I agree with you that if you take two things together and you say you suddenly have von Stockelhausen syndrome, you may not have von Stockelhausen syndrome. You've just invented something that doesn't exist. And it just makes you sound erudite, even though you haven't proven that there's any kind of linkage. On the other hand, you also embedded in there, the question is, if I can't find anything on physical exam, does that mean you're not having a migraine? And to my knowledge, I cannot do a blood test while you're having a migraine and find the CRP is up or something is happening. And yet I would not deny that you're having a headache. So we should remain open-minded to the possibility that people can have symptomatic issues or symptoms, if you like, in the absence of a physical finding and in the absence of a blood test.
Right. But I think that's probably why psychiatry it's been quite difficult to find genes, for example, for psychiatric disorders, because when it's all based on kind of report or based on how you feel, it's quite difficult, or migraine is another good example. It's pretty difficult to pin down who is affected and who isn't. So I agree with you totally. Of course, you can be ill with a completely normal physical exam, and clearly. But I think the point I was just trying to make was that a syndrome is supposed to be a collection of features which occur together more expected than by chance. Some of those may have no physical signs, but some of them I think have to have some physical signs or some way of EEG, some kind of diagnosis is all I really meant. But I agree with you.
Thank you very much. Kevin, you want to make a comment? You have a question?
Sure. Oops. Sure. Thanks, Marcel, for a fantastic talk. And just because you're quite modest, I should add, for the benefit of the group, that your work on TB infection and its duration has really reshaped a lot of the thinking in this area. So thank you for sharing some of that with the group today. My question was, when you were talking about the sort of the ancient history, if you will, Laennec and Louis, I'm wondering how it was surmised that tubercles predated symptoms by 6 months to 2 years, because presumably, I wasn't sure if these were autopsy findings, in which case presumably it wasn't possible to follow people, or or was it more sort of comparison of people with and without symptoms, pre-mortem, or how was that judgment made? Just out of curiosity.
The way that Louis and Laennec worked is they examined people and they followed them in time. And in fact, that's how Laennec validated the stethoscope. He listened to people. He combined percussion, which somebody on the call is going to remind me came from an Austrian doctor who used to percuss the height of the wine in the casks, and then the auscultation immédiate of Laennec. And by following people in time, then later on, when people died, they would do autopsies and they'd find, like as Laennec described, he'd find somebody who may got kicked by a horse or fell off a carriage. And then when he did the autopsy, he found miliary tubercles in their lungs. And he says, go figure. So the idea was it was longitudinal sampling of people you had done ante-mortem physical exams on. And you had kept notes on how they were doing. And then when they died, you looked at them and say, hey, now how Louis was able to come up with 6 to 24 months, I don't know exactly.
Yeah, well, that was kind of, I mean, I can understand
was,
like asymptomatic people having tubercles and whatever that, you know, as you said, they fell off a horse or whatever, or they had an autopsy. That part's clear. It's the sort of longitudinal aspect to this that I was a bit uncertain about.
Yeah, I'll try to look it up, Kevin, because I owe you a better answer than that. But fortunately, in the chat, Ines has saved me and told us that it was Auenbrugger who was the one who brought in the percussion, and then Laennec combined the percussion and auscultation. I owe you a fuller answer, Kevin.
Thanks again.
It looks like, did David Rosenblatt have a question?
Yeah, David, you have a question? Do you want to say it verbally or you want me to read your comment?
It can be either way, but Marcel, that was absolutely wonderful, and something we have to do more often, because I'm sure this applies to every single field. My major concern is the mutation versus variant argument, and whether something has to be directly linked to causing a disease and shown to be a mutation, but mutation has disappeared pretty much in the genetic literature. And people talk about pathogenic variants or likely benign variants, but anybody can find their own examples, I am sure. But I think I always worry about labeling people as having diseases just because they have a change in their gene. And that's going to happen more and more because they're just like we use biomarkers now to cause people sick. And I worry about people showing variants in genes causing and then calling them sick. So I don't think we have a good classification. And how do we unlearn what we've learned in medical school? Because I think there has to be a re-indoctrination, because we don't unlearn what we learned before, particularly in terms of nomenclatures. Addison disease means different things to different people.
Sure. Well, I am optimistic that we do have capacity to learn and that we aren't completely hardwired to our 25-year-old selves. But I agree with you also, David, that if you find a mutation in somebody, there may be the linked concept that that person is a mutant. And I'd like to think that we are all variants, or we are variable, or we are all interesting, but we aren't mutants. And I think you're right that there's a problem assigning that a polymorphism or variant is a mutation if we don't know what happens next. And I think you're right. The kind of deep dives I've done just for 2 adjectives on TB could probably be done in many other fields of medicine.
Marcel, I have a question for you. In terms of your definition about latent TB and rethinking that, how has that made it into the guidelines yet?
It surprisingly has not changed the Canadian guidelines, as Kevin can attest to, because the Canadian guidelines were very reasonable and evidence-based, and they recommended screening contacts who are very, very high risk because they've been recently infected. And therefore they have a very high rate of disease, as Louis suggested, and also high risk groups. Where it's been more difficult is other countries have taken a different approach, and they're still subscribing to the idea that a quarter or a third of all people around the world are infected. I'm going to go to screen share, and I'm going to show you the US guideline here, if it works. So this is from the Centers for Disease Control in the United States. And they've decided that setting aside contacts and high-risk people, they suggest that there's 13 million people in the US who are living with inactive TB, and TB is hiding in plain sight. And this, what you could call an outreach program, looks a bit unfortunate to me. It only has a translation into 1 language, and if you put your mouse over it, it helpfully tells you, in case you're unaware, it's a Vietnamese family. I polled 9 of my colleagues from McGill Medicine who are either Chinese or Vietnamese ancestry and asked them what they thought about this outreach campaign. One of them felt that this hide in plain sight sounds a bit too much like the Viet Cong, and another person said that sometimes stereotypes risk becoming caricatures. So in the United States, the vision now is that we should just be screening everybody and looking for all 13 million people in the US who live with inactive TB. And I don't think this is the highest yield way forward, and I think it may lead to some discomfort in some communities. I think fortunately the Canadian guidelines are still very much compatible with my thinking, and Kevin can also confirm that the Canadian guidelines have maintained a very reasonable focus on who we should be screening.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I think we'll stop there. We're coming up on the hour. So thank you very much, Marcel, for this wonderful lecture. And thanks everyone for joining us and for your comments and discussion this afternoon. I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.
Marcel, there's other messages.
I'll stay on.
Stay on. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you.